Thanks. Let me start by saying definitely drop the doctor. Just Chris is fine, especially in a room like this with so many other doctors. Thanks very much for inviting me to say a few words. First, I'd like to congratulate the finalists of the inaugural Think Big competition. Reading your essays reminded me of how little I know about the complex world we live in and how hard it can be to think through our economic challenges. Your analyses are innovative and capture well the difficult trade-offs present in economic policy. I'd also like to thank the organizers of this event. It's been a long time coming. Competitions like this are, in my view, a great idea. They provide a fantastic platform for discussing our economic problems. We need far more engagement and dialogue as they are critical to forming a common sense of how to move forward. So more of these certainly need to be in the pipeline. So I've joined you today not as the chief economist of the SARB, which really gives me a great amount of pleasure because it means that I can escape talking about monetary policy, which I have to do kind of constantly, and it's really nice to talk about something different. And in particular, something that I've spent quite a long time thinking a lot about through a very long involvement with URSA, Economic Research Southern Africa, along with some other people in the room, including Mr. Elias Masalela there and others who have been stalwarts in keeping URSA going and giving it direction over many years. URSA is a co-sponsor of this event as well. I've also been a pretty long-standing observer of the South African economy, having, before my time at the bank, worked in the Treasury for many years. So the comments I make today are my own and in no way attributable to the Reserve Bank. Just to repeat, no monetary policy. So the other great thing about today is that this competition is about solutions to problems. And so I didn't feel like I had to come up here and say anything about solutions. I could actually take a rather different tack and say a few things at a high level about some of the things that over the many years I've been in South Africa seem to get in the way of improving the economy. And some of these things, many of these things will be very familiar to you, but what worries me is that they still get in the way. And I would like to see that change eventually. I won't try to overreach, and I'll try to keep things pretty simple. So let me start by saying that, of course, South Africa has experienced about 15 years of weak economic growth. In fact, the 2010s were the worst decade of growth in the post-World War II period. The economy expanded by only 16% over the decade, compared to the 39% expansion experienced during the decade before. I also apologize. I usually do presentations, not speeches, so this is a technology that's I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. Between 2013 and 2019, per capita income growth was either zero or negative, averaging negative 0.4%, and is likely to remain negative for the rest of the decade. About 55% of South Africans fall below the poverty line. We have many young South Africans entering the labor force every year, but the rate of job creation is nowhere near sufficient to employ them and to also deal with the normal churn that we see of jobs lost in the economy. Since 2008, the labor force has grown by 33%, while total employment has only risen by 15%. The inability to create jobs lies at the heart of many of our economic challenges and certainly is the major factor in perpetuating inequality. Better outcomes are on the horizon. I think that's reasonably clear, but the near-term outlook for growth still remains below par and not what it should be. Output growth this year is expected to be around 1.1%, well below longer-term averages of about 3%. Contrast this to growth in other emerging markets, which are forecast to average 4.1% over the next 3 years. Today, investment levels are just 15% of GDP, again much lower than the 25% level, consistent with more rapid economic expansion. So one of the many curiosities we face, and I faced in my professional career for many, many years, is why, given the amount of work done on our severe growth and inequality challenges, we seem to make little headway in solving them. South Africa is certainly not the only country in the world where much economic analysis and policy advice is discounted, but it is unusual and begs the question of why we give so many of the good ideas short shrift. I want to highlight a few of the reasons I see for this, and this is where things get a bit complicated. First, South Africa's inward-looking history gave rise to a set of approaches to some very big and very important economic ideas that has made it hard to take advantage of them. In this list, I would include the importance of cross-border economic activity, trade and capital, how they impact on growth, and integration into global value chains. The cost on not being a more open economy are both large and pernicious, not least in nurturing a focus on import substitution rather than taking advantage of the knowledge creation and the spillovers associated with global markets. South Africa could have done better with the endowments it has. They are many, and there is quite a lot of domestic innovation here. But much greater diversification and much better outcomes certainly could have been achieved if we compare ourselves to other countries, and also across a much wider range of human capital. And I think this is an important point. A simple measure I like of success about our interaction with the global economy is whether or not it has helped the economy's overall size keep pace with population growth and the level of human capital. But as I noted above, our high level of unemployment shows that this just clearly has not been the case. Second, and in part because of our inward focus, we too actively manage or set rules for how our markets work at a microeconomic level. Price movements are there to signal to economic actors whether to produce, not to produce, create jobs or not, and so on. But we obscure such signals when we get regulatory controls wrong or when they cause prices to be fixed or move only in one direction. This fundamental challenge affects a wide range of critical markets, from labor to energy. In the labor market, it results in weak demand as prices cannot adjust for productivity. In energy, it results in excess demand and fixed supply. In both cases, the opportunity costs to the economy are very large, never mind the many social costs. My third area of concern is the balance between the public and the private. We like to argue a lot here about whether a reduction in the pace of growth in public spending is austerity or not. For what it's worth, this particular question is both well answered by the data and not terribly useful for making progress on economic growth. The right question is whether our public services are fit for purpose. That public services are necessary for economic growth and inclusion should really not be the subject of great empirical debate. More pragmatism about the role of the public sector, whether it should be bigger or smaller, is needed, and it should be based on measurable outcomes. We need to recognize that where outcomes of public services are poor, inclusion will be the very first casualty, in part because the private markets that are left over will discriminate between those able to pay and those that cannot. Again, this observation need not be overly contested, but it does and should place a burden on the public sector to modernize and improve what it does, including, at times, competing with the private sector. Public services should be focused on making economic inclusion as costless as possible. And that principle of measurable outcomes and the bar we're setting there about making inclusion costless as possible should extend throughout the public sector to all domains where they are appropriate and where they matter. This should include housing, this should include transport, this should include all facets of urban planning and many of the other spatial dimensions of our economic lives. Getting this right will have fundamental economic benefits, in my view, even if some of these are quite indirect, and we don't think about these often. In particular, I think a lot about how public services reduce the cost of labor supply, feeding eventually down the line into the competitiveness of exports or import competing goods and services. Better public services make the cost of economic activity lower, and this really needs to be a critical focus area. Finally, I want to cut against the grain a bit of most economic instruction, which separates out microeconomics from macroeconomics, and which suggests often that microeconomic factors and outcomes do little to constrain or create opportunities for macroeconomic policy. In the real world, this is unhelpful in some very critical respects, not least in how it affects how we think about the macroeconomic policy environment. As I noted earlier, there isn't much data to support the accusation often made that the fiscal authorities are pursuing austerity. Since the GFC, our budget deficit has on average been around 4.5% of GDP and is forecast to remain at 4% over the next 3 years. In my footnotes, I can give you the public debt numbers, but I think you probably all know them. But it is fair to say that over the last decade, more spending has done little for economic growth. I've set out a couple of microeconomic reasons why that seems to be the case, but simply put, we don't get value for money, as a notable Chief Justice has put it recently. Does this mean we borrow and spend more to reach that elusive growth that we want? Or should monetary policy just need to be loosened radically, and that this would generate lots of economic growth as we borrow ever more? So here's the challenge from a macroeconomic perspective. When our consumption exceeds savings, we run a current account deficit. If growth fails to increase, and keep in mind that capital assets account for 5% of government spending, then we get more portfolio flows that encourage more consumption rather than the direct investment that encourages productive capacity. As a result, our debt rises and costs more. Our sovereign risk increases, both raising the long-term cost of borrowing and depreciating the exchange rate. This fails, however, to balance the current account deficit because inflation rises and in turn reverses any of the temporary real exchange rate gain we might have had, and because spending never falls. So this is a vicious circle, and one that cannot be made better with more expansionary macroeconomic policy settings. Bringing the macro and micro together, we can think in terms of basic aggregate supply and demand curves. Our supply curve is inelastic, and shocks shift it to the left. Take away energy, what happens to your supply curve? Shifts to the left. This reduces real growth and increases inflation for any rise in aggregate demand. More positive shocks, like fixing the energy problem, alternatively shifts the supply curve to the right, while better functioning markets at the micro level flattens its slope and delivers more real GDP and less inflation for every increase in aggregate demand. So the key here is to get to the reforms, structural primarily, certainly investment-driven, that help move that supply curve. Spending can help in that goal, but it has to be much more effective and targeted and benchmarked more widely against best practice in the rest of the world. These ideas are hardly new. They are similar to those presented in Michael Spence's 2008 growth report, where they looked at the fastest growing countries, 25 fastest growing countries over long periods of time. They're similar to those presented by Danny Roderick in his Growth Puzzle book. And they're very similar to the lots of work that Ricardo Hausmann has done, especially his Growth through Inclusion report. And the list goes on. But far too often in our corner of the world, we ignore the microeconomics and settle on demands for more spending or cutting interest rates as quickly as possible, despite the abundant evidence that these don't work very well. At the end of the day, bad microeconomics makes good macroeconomic policy very hard, and it certainly cannot be solved. They certainly cannot be solved by making them worse. They need to work better together. So it's past time to move from that vicious circle to a virtuous circle of growth. Key to this is to let the evidence basis direct our views and our actions, no matter how strongly we want to hold on to our beliefs. I think that is clear, and that is the life of this engagement that we're having today. So let me conclude by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to say a few things about my own about the growth challenge that we face, and I will now give way to the panel discussion. Thanks.